That was
Hello.
loud.
It really wants you to know. Hi, I'm Marcus Burley. I'm the clinical director of Self-Space, a group private practice with offices in Seattle and on the East Side. And today I'm very excited to be introducing Dania Uritskiy on therapy and the multicultural perspective. I think we all want to be very welcoming to the many different types of clients that come into our offices, and then working directly with culture of origin and multicultural issues is a key element of that. Today's training is going to be 2 hours. Dania will walk through some more of the specifics of the formatting, but the way that you get CEUs is that at the end of the training, I'll send a link in the Zoom chat along with the email address of Alyssa, who you will email once you've completed the form. It's a pretty brief, just online form that you fill out. But if you have any questions about that, you can also email Alyssa if you're not sure what to do with that. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Dania.
Thank you, Marcus. So yes, once again, my name is Dania. My pronouns are she, her. And I am so excited to host this training today, and thank you all for attending this training and kind of having conversation around this topic. I'm a presenter who very much likes to have conversation just because I'm not an expert in every single aspect or facet of multicultural work, every culture. So I want people to share and chime in their experiences, what culture means to them as we walk through this training today together. So if you need to unmute yourself, you can either raise your hand and Marcus will do it for you, or you can feel free to do it yourself anytime you have something that you want to share, alongside with questions. So I'm very much one of those people that if you have a question, go ahead and ask it, even if we're in the middle of talking about something else. If you want to save your questions towards the end too, I think we're going to save 5 to 10 minutes towards the end of our presentation to kind of just cover any other topics, any other things that might have popped up throughout the presentation. I'm also going to give us a 5-minute bathroom/water break at 10 a.m.
Yeah.
So I'll try to be very mindful of that, that time once we get there. Okay. So just to give you guys a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. So just like the title gives, we are going to talk about culture of origin. And I want you all to kind of just be very reflective, very curious of what that means for both yourself as clinicians and the client populations that you work with and provide services to. Just because that is how we start to get very comfortable and very curious around the topic of culture, because it means so many different things. I'm also going to go into some of the backgrounds that make up my culture of origin. I say that and I include that part in the presentation just because, again, I'm not an expert in every single culture or multiculturalism, in every single topic. I'm going to present it from the perspective of the client bases that I work with, which are predominantly of Asian American descent and Hispanic and Latino and Latinx origin. And the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx origin is also part of my cultural identity. So there's going to be lenses that are kind of framed around that. Again, I am welcoming all of you to also kind of bring in your own stories and your own perspectives, because I think that just makes a very enriching topic and way to explore this. I want to kick off our training and, kind of just ask people what drew them into this training today. How'd you sign up to be here with us today?
I can go first.
Go for it.
Yeah. First of all, I'm an immigrant here, and my cultural background, I'm Armenian, and I work because I speak 3 languages. Client population that come to me, it's mostly Russians, Armenians, and Europeans who want to work with culture that are closer to them. They usually describe it as you are more direct. If I go to an American therapist, they say nice thing to me, but I don't trust it, and you are more direct. That's where first when they come in intake, they mostly say. And so that's why it's very interesting for me, because to have a perspective of it, because I did not have any specific studies of how, just my experience.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Margarita, because that is also a very poignant reason of why this is a very big passion topic for me, and why it's something that I think for a lot of clinicians of color, they brought it into their practice and their work, because it's not something that necessarily there's a lot of literature and research on. It's changed throughout the years, but I even remember starting out as an undergrad, there wasn't a lot of material to kind of go from, that I think through just curiosity and also through just experience, you start to kind of build that for yourself. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
I know for me, not from being not in the Latino community, but having worked with the Latino community in a previous workplace, there was a lot of learning about culturally appropriate communication. And especially I remember making eye contact. I had a client that at least I was glad she shared that, I was making too much direct eye contact with her. And so while in perhaps a white American culture, that would be considered a respectful way to engage, that was almost felt intimidating to her. And so to realize the small physical pieces of cultural communication, that really opened my eyes much more to all different cultural expectations and meanings that the same gestures could have, or the types of questions could have.
Yeah, beautiful example. Thank you, Marcus. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm sitting in a hotel room right now, but wanted to join the training. I work in a predominantly white city, and I just, for my own personal benefit, just feel like I need to continue doing work around multicultural perspectives, even if it appears to be a white perspective, it might not always be. So I just mostly want to grow and learn. So thanks for having me.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. One thing I'm also going to share, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, I've even used the multicultural perspective or bicultural perspective, even with clients who are of Caucasian descent or American descent too, because I know every time I ask that question with my white clients, they're like, I don't have culture. And I'm like, we all have culture. We all have somewhere we come from, right? And when there's a part of my presentation that will get into that a little bit more, but it's just important to kind of recognize we all have a story and all have a framework that we come from. And even if it's something that's part of the majority culture of the country that we're in, for example, that's still a culture within itself. And it's important to know and recognize what aspects of that come up. So, all right. Well, let me see if I can move there we go. So a reason that I wanted to bring this topic into conversation, specifically here in Seattle, there's a lot of diversity that a lot of residents of Seattle, a lot of newly immigrated people that are living in Seattle are coming in and, seeking therapy. And again, given that our profession has a predominantly American white sort of perspective, I think it's important for all of us to be able to have, just reference points of what's the culture, what's the perspective that I'm coming from, and also the clients that are sitting across from me that might come from very different backgrounds. Hopefully today we can have a really good sort of like discussion of connecting with who we are and the parts of us that make up that identity. So we can also kind of create the same curiosity with our own clients that we're working. I think it also kind of like in Marcus's example where it was a different, culture of origin that he was working with from his own, but he started to kind of understand, oh, for some of my clients, that direct eye contact that I would normally kind of associate as I'm attentive, I'm listening, I'm here with you, I'm connected with you, might not necessarily land the same way, right? Can be ways that we, again, through not through like something intentionally trying to, like not understand, but just kind of through conversation, there's just going to be blind spots that we all have. And the more aware that we are about those, the more that we talk to people around them, the more that we start to learn and kind of adjust those things, right? I know sometimes with some of my Asian American clients, talking about family and family of origin stuff has been something that I've had to kind of adjust my approach than with other populations that I work with, because it's a particularly very private and tender and sensitive topic that has just kind of come up through my practicing and me, trying things out and seeing what works and what doesn't. In another sense, too, I think the more aware we are of like these cultural components and the historical significance of it, we also start breaking down the system of colonization that so many communities have had to face, and also start breaking down the systems of oppression. Just because I know, I'll give an example and I'll go into this a little bit more. In the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx community, there's so much internal sort of like colorism, racism that comes from a very historical place. And it's something that for many people in different generations has really affected their ability to feel appreciated, feel connected to their identity, feel like they're, a person of worth, depending on, what they look like, or, the color of their skin or the texture of their hair. And it's really interesting to kind of look at where those origins come from, because it's not really something that's talked about, yet it's so present in a lot of aspects of our lives, right? And I know that my culture isn't the only one that goes through this. There's plenty of other cultures that have experienced colonialism that have a lot of similar sort of like parallels that come into it. Nope. So I'm going to talk about my identity for a second. So I identify as female. I've talked about how, my cultural background is Latina, Hispanic, Latinx. I also identify as mestiza, which is coming from that Spanish racial caste system that was implemented in the colonial period in the Americas. So there's mulatto, which means that you're mixed with European and African. There's mestiza, which is indigenous and European mixture. And I think part of it too is kind of knowing and understanding the context of that and what that meant during that time. So I think it's really important to kind of talk about some of these terminologies and that we identify with, because I know there's a lot of people in my community that also feel like, there's a lot of anger and shame and, frustration towards these terms. And it makes sense once we start to kind of break it down, but it's also a part of our identity, and it's a part of how we kind of like identify, our cultural backgrounds and heritage. I'm also first generation American. So my parents immigrated from El Salvador during the 70s and 80s, which was experiencing a lot of political and social turmoil. And we also went through a civil war. So there's a lot of El Salvadoran Americans that there's a lot of El Salvadorans who ended up immigrating to America during that period of time and ended up relocating in Washington, D.C. and in the Los Angeles area. So I'm part of that wave of immigrant people. And, you know, there's a lot of us that were born here in the United States, and we kind of existed in this like bicultural sort of place. So we were kind of navigating the tensions of growing up in an American society, but also having the expectations of our parents and kind of like their points of view, how they grew up, bringing all of that from their country of origins. I'm also married to an immigrant. So my husband is of Russian descent, which is another part too that, you know, is really interesting to, you know, kind of consider his immigration experience and what kind of came up for him, and, you know, just kind of like being very curious about all of those parts. Now, I would like you guys to talk about what your cultural identities, or what are some of those things that you're kind of noticing for yourself come up.
Yeah, it's I know for me, being Jewish, but like passing as white or also being white is always part of my identity story. My parents being from the East Coast and then moving, and me growing up on the West Coast. But so being part of a very, you know, very much a minority, but also fully like participating in the majority Caucasian and male aspects is something that I don't know exactly what to do with all the time, but it's something I have to certainly hold both of those things.
Thank you, Marcus.
Well, if no one is going, mine is because I'm coming from the country that is very small and became small during the long history. I feel sometimes very kind of a sadness or bitterness when people ask or they assume about my country or culture, and because and it's very long, kind of more than 4,000 years of a history. It's has been a lot of wars, and especially lately. A month ago, I lost my country and my hometown to Azerbaijan took it away. A lot of this feeling of we were long time. I was studying in Armenia and Karabakh and Nagorno-Karabakh, and I grew up, and our history is victimizing, like that we are victim, and being proud of survival, always being proud of surviving the genocide and afterwards. So I'm trying to, I'm have a client that are Jewish Israelis, and right now looking what they are going through, and a month ago what I was going through, which was similar if I were a Palestinian side. So a lot of this conflict of political, cultural, and then working with my client, their views, and my internal story and my view and my anger towards to Israel, so I find it very difficult sometimes. I have a lot of friends that are from different culture, and so it's yeah. I don't have a word, but I feel like it's mostly kind of identifying with a culture that is hidden from the world, that no one knows, and you are kind of hiding, but you want to be loud and say about it and be proud about it, but people hear and then they say, oh, Romania, or then it kind of devalues it because they completely thought about other.
Thank you for sharing, Margarita. I think something too that you also landed on, like there's so many different ways that, you know, like there's a lot of complexity to these conversations, right? Because there's parts that we're very connected to and very proud of. There's also a lot of hurt, a lot of trauma that comes in too. And I think in a way, the way that I've guided sort of like the multicultural like exploration is in a sense of empowerment and a sense of also connecting with who you are. Yes, like there's adversity, there's things that we've experienced that are part of our story, part of our family story that will always be a part of us. But I think there's also that part too where our story keeps on going and we can kind of connect to all of the parts of it to just bring additional perspective and additional, sort of just like connectedness to all of those different parts of the identity and all of those different parts of the experience, right?
Dania, I have a question
Go for it.
that's been kind of percolating. How do you make sense of just, figuring out what is someone's sort of cultural identity like and a part of their culture, whether presently or in the past, and an individual difference?
Can you explain individual difference to me and like what you're meaning
Yeah.
there?
I was thinking about it when Marcus was talking about, the eye contact. And I was
Mhm.
wondering when that person, and maybe Marcus, you can speak to this too, when that person was saying like, oh, like there's a lot of eye contact and like how beautiful that, like you said, that they were felt safe enough and trusting enough to say that in the first place and give some feedback. But I guess I found myself thinking like, well, was that her preference or was that sort of more of a cultural expectation or. And so I guess I'm wondering in those situations, how do you figure it out? And are you just exploring more or what's your perspective on that?
Good question. I think it's more of an exploration because you're right. Like I think it depends on person, country, region, all of this stuff where, again, we can't just assume like, oh, this one culture, this is a preference for everybody of that culture. I think we start kind of having conversations and saying like, oh, is this something that I see with possible other clients that I'm working with? And if we start to kind of notice an overlap, then I think we can start to see like this is probably maybe tied more with the culture. If it's specific to the one client, then, we kind of see maybe it's like an individual preference there. But I think it's always too like important to just have conversation around that and kind of talk through some of those things. I'll say too, with with some of my Hispanic clients, I've seen too, like a part that I've connected with them is kind of bringing and sharing, stories of, like family and experiences that kind of tie into parts of the work that we've been doing because it's just something that I think in Hispanic culture, again, not generalizing to everybody, but generally in Hispanic culture, there's kind of this sense of we learn from others in our community through experiences and through stories. And you can see this like how we kind of treat doctors and medical visits. We don't really do like the research thing. We kind of go and talk with others. And it's like, what was your experience with this person? How did you feel about that? It's kind of like that education with other people or other people that are part of your community. I saw somebody had their hand up.
Yeah, Shaquille, did you have welcome.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you for hosting this conversation. Something I'm thinking about as you're talking as well is even like the culture that's like between in the kind of intersubjective space between like client and clinician, like the fact that I am a Black male-bodied person is interacting with the culture of the person that's coming into to experience time with me. So I think about the example that we've been talking about, like it might be something about the person's culture, and it's also about like what their culture knows about interacting with my own body, and what happens in that kind of intermingling, which makes it like more complicated. Like I might have an idea about a culture, but like what does my body mean to that culture is also the question, I think.
Yeah. Very, very good point too, Shaquille. Thank you for sharing that.
I love that word complicated. It enriches it in a very complicated way.
Yeah.
It's not just understanding just the signal, like it's not a one signal back and forth. It's like really mixing and brewing up, hopefully, a good connection and communication there.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share other parts of their identity or culture that are coming up for them?
You do have me thinking about so many things. Just also the vitality of the therapist client interaction. I love what was just brought up about that, because it's also a process of really encountering our assumptions about each other, and being and trying to remain curious and open about those, and not sort of shut down in that space. As far as cultural identity, you have me thinking about just how important it was in my family. I'm from a large family, and our Irish roots are very important. Grandparents came to the US during the famine years in Ireland. So lots of identification with, I think, with social justice and oppression. And that's still a very strong strain in my family. And I have connected with so many clients from different cultures because of growing up Catholic, and just having some understanding of some aspects of what that can mean. Certainly not, we're not all the same, but just that's been a kind of a good connecting thread for me with a lot of clients. So.
Beautiful, Emily. Thank you. Sheila, you were going to say something?
Yeah, this is such an interesting conversation because, I just identify as just like I'm a straight up white woman in America, and I think, a couple of things for me are like being from the Midwest, growing up in a really conservative Christian family. Like I get all that, but it's funny because my last name's Storr, which is Swiss German. So I've always just identified like, oh, I'm German, I'm Swiss, like whatever. And then I just did 23andMe, and I looked at my results this week and I'm like, I'm pretty English. Like, and it was sort of this thing like, I have no idea. And so it's, I mean, now I do because of Ancestry.me, but there's also a little bit of, hearing all of you talk, like there's also kind of this like sadness of not having this kind of rich, having this, I don't know, like deeper, richer connection to culture or origin, or if that makes sense.
And this is also another part of the work that I like to do is knowing these things about ourselves. We can connect and we can build whatever relationship we want with those parts of our identity, whether it's, like many generations in the United States, but we come from somewhere. We might come from England or Ireland or, Switzerland or whatever, right? Or I've also had clients that, might be like half white or half Filipino, but they haven't really had a lot of that connection with their Filipino side. And there's like shame or, sort of guilt, like this is a part of me, but I don't really know that much about it. And we get curious about that. And we have conversations around like, well, this is a part of your identity. How do you want to connect with it? How would you like to go forward with it? And it's really beautiful to see because we start sort of learning maybe other parts of ourselves or other places that we come from. And all of a sudden we have a very beautiful and sort of like different experience than it just being a part of, like how we might have connected with it before, right? I think there's a sense of empowerment there too, where we all have these parts. There's sad stories, there's beautiful stories, there's everything in between connected with it. But that's what makes us up. And that's why it's important to know where we come from and where, what our culture is. And that's why everybody has a culture, even if we have been, many generations in the United States, right? My dad would always share, like, he's like, the United States is like one of those places where you see so many different people and so many different cultures just like coming together. And when my husband and I got married, for example, he's like, only in the United States you'd see an El Salvadoran girl and a Russian man getting married. But it's beautiful, right? And again, the US has a lot of things that are far from perfect. But I think given our history, given a lot of the sort of just like mixing of cultures that we have, that is definitely something that is beautiful that we share and we've kind of just brought into the mix of who we are, right? All right. Well, so just like we've all been talking about, culture of origin kind of allows us to have a deeper connection to our stories, our clients' stories, and just understand ourselves better. There was a book that I read a couple years ago. I think it's called It Didn't Start With You. I don't know if anybody else has read it, but it's really interesting because the way that the book is kind of like framed and kind of talking about like family story, culture of origin, all of these things is it's shaped like in a story sort of format. It's not just something that happened with this generation, but sometimes that trauma can be carried over into following generations. And again, the more that we're connected with our origins and our story, the more we start to understand what happened to my grandparents during the Civil War in El Salvador is something that even if my parents didn't experience it, they were still affected. And even if I didn't experience it, that's still a part of my story. And that can sometimes be a way of healing, a way of kind of maybe understanding more deeper, complex parts of ourselves than just, kind of being like, oh, well, this is just attributed to anxiety and that's it. Or this is just attributed to depression and that's it. I think the way that the author kind of framed it, it creates this very sort of like deeper and richer and more curious place to kind of explore some of the symptoms that clients come into working with us around, or sometimes trauma and how it kind of shows up. I think it's also just a beautiful way to build rapport because, again, we're not just seeing the client in this one sort of like perspective or, just this one format. We're embracing everybody from like a very holistic perspective of who are you? Tell me about you. I want to know more about you and where you come from. And I think that just kind of allows people to walk in a little bit more just like vulnerable, a little bit more, sort of curious about themselves. And ultimately, my biggest goal through this and what I want to encourage from you guys too is continuing the healing of oppression. Because I know there's many different ways that as therapists, we try to engage in sort of deconstructing the larger systems of oppression. But this can be a way that is beautiful, that impacts a client's life and kind of continues that work through empowering them to, stay connected with who they are, right? So yeah. So I want to ask you guys, given some of you have, continue to work with people of different backgrounds, some of you, are curious about what that work might look like. What might be some questions that you might ask to kind of initiate those explorations around culture and identity and things like that?
I'll jump in maybe.
Go for it.
I love to do this. I love sometimes the word culture, I think, unless people are like very much identify with, and that means something to them, that sometimes there's this sort of like, there might be a staring back at me, like what, if I'm inviting thoughts about culture, but I feel like community can really get to the heart of what's meaningful to people. If there are communities they feel a part of, or family, or just sort of like just curious, kind of open questions about like what's meaningful to you, where are the different ways in your life that you play a role, or what, tell me a bit about the different places you go in your life, and who you're relating to and how, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emily.
I know what I find myself doing is kind of at first waiting to see if the person just naturally brings in that piece of their story, because some do pretty early on.
Mm-hmm.
If not, I find like location and then like following up is helpful. Like, how long have you been living here, or where'd you move from? And like I know with clients I've had from India, whose families are still in India but who are working in the US, they'll say, "Oh, I'm from India," and I ask, "Well, what part of India are you from?" Which is like such an easy question to ask, but I think one that is not asked all that often. And then it's already much more specific into the person's culture. And then they're telling me, like, I often see people then opening up a bit more, like, "Oh, you actually are interested in not just like knowing the label that might carry my cultural identity, but like getting some actual context coming from." And it enables them to be the expert and me to just be curious, because, and then invites into kind of a values conversations down the line of like, what are the most important values for your culture? How does that intersect with what you're running into here? Those kinds of things. Yeah.
Beautiful, Marcus. I will say, having a lot of Indian clients or Indian American clients, there's so many people that kind of just like, "Oh, India, one, country," but in reality, there's so many differences like regionally that it's super important to ask, yeah, like what part of India are you from? Because north from south, there's a lot of differences in cuisine, in language and like different things too. Amisha, you had your hand up. Oh, we can't hear
you're
you.
on mute still.
I was gonna say, yeah, I can speak to that because I am first generation Indian American or Indian Canadian. My parents also migrated from India back in the early 70s. So it is funny because when because you can't just assume where they're coming from in India because of the differences of culture, of the identity. Because just because I'm Indian American, that doesn't mean they had the same experience as myself. And so it's very like interesting because not necessarily each, like, even it depends when you migrated to, like, was it the early 70s, was it the late 70s, 80s, 90s, like, because it could be so different in so many different regions and how they gravitate towards that. So I just wanted to put in my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Amisha. Yeah. I know for the Hispanic community, it's kind of a similar thing because depending if you're from North or South, North America, Central America or South America, or, Mexico, like there's different reasons or different immigration waves that have taken place, right? Like with Mexico, it's been sort of like a long historical, sort of like immigration, whereas other parts of the Americas have had very different sort of like waves coming into the United States and reasons that they've had to immigrate. I think another part too is, I know there's a lot of Hispanics that also say like, we are not a monolith. We are different countries, literally, that, border each other, might have, like similar cultural aspects or cultural values, but somebody from Colombia is going to be very different than somebody from Honduras or somebody from, Panama, for example, or somebody from Puerto Rico. There's going to be all of these regional differences where we have ties and commonalities that are beautiful, but they're still different. There's different countries. Erin, you're going to say something?
First off, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I was just thinking too that it is so important to get curious and not just like settle on like the first large label, because I'm even thinking about my husband who's Indian, but whenever people ask like, oh, where are you from? Like, what's your culture? What do you identify with? He struggles because like at 14, he started living in Dubai. So in really formative years, he lived in this like really quite westernized experience. And so he kind of presents more like a first generation person rather than an immigrant, but also as like this amalgamation of cultures. So I think leading with curiosity is so important, and not just making assumptions on the first label, because there are so many things that can intersect with that and create a richer conveying of that story of what actually they resonate with.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the specifics are so much more real and powerful. I mean, I get curious too of like, are they from a big city or a small town? Like that makes a huge difference into a lot of value systems that you might have grown up with. And so also, I think just like the interest in people's histories is very respectful. Like I don't have to know the history of everyone's culture ahead of time to be like really respectful about finding out some, of the big things that are relevant to the client.
Anybody else have any other questions or ways that they might guide the conversation around culture or cultural identity?
Dania, I work with a lot of women who have experienced childhood emotional neglect. And sometimes there's some resistance when it comes to getting into the childhood and some of those formative years. But what I found can be really interesting is talking about how they were shown love growing up and letting that kind of softly lead to exploration of how did that compare to people around them, to others in their community, and letting that guide the conversation toward culture in a way that I don't know, for some of my folks, it's just like a little bit of a softer way. And I wanted to share that because I found it to be so impactful.
Beautiful, Lily. That is a beautiful way to guide that conversation. I was actually going to say I think it was 2 years ago, Self Space had a training with somebody who worked with the Southeast Asian community. And she had mentioned using kind of like, in a way, parts work, but she would kind of use like the chair technique where she would have this client kind of maybe talk to parts of herself or she would have her clients kind of do parts work in that way. And it seemed to kind of like what Lily was saying, it seemed to be an easier way to kind of broach some of these more tender topics with this population where, she was able to kind of see them just like open up and not bump up against those defenses as much. And I was curious and I tried it. And with some of my clients who were of Vietnamese descent or, Indian descent or, from other places, it seemed to be something that was super powerful because it wasn't, well, tell me, like how, tell me like what traumas you've experienced with your family. But it was more of a, sort of guided, gentle conversation where we could kind of gradually transition into that and, kind of explore those parts in a way that, again, is restorative, is curious, and it leads to a lot of conversation and connection. So.
I know like my internal frame, and then the frame that I think I bring is, I think it was really helpful for me when I learned about like racial identity development, and that I can kind of come in as a white man and be like, oh, well, this, whatever culture's on the other side of me, like they're already the expert in their own, like how their race and culture has impacted them. And that's not necessarily true. And I think that can do a lot of harm if I don't come in with like, they may be in any place around like how they understand themselves. And then because I work with a lot of men around anger, a lot of times they come in being very angry at their own culture, and almost are eliciting a role in me to join them in like hating what is missing there, right? But there's something missing in all cultures because of harm. So then with a lot of my anger work that a lot of you guys have heard me talk about is like grief work. And so that's really like, even within my own, like, you know, like within the white culture, a lot of it's like been that erasing of your culture, right? And so like, but I also haven't been invited to grapple with that, how that has negatively impacted me, and then helps me perpetuate harm if I'm not aware of that. So kind of the framework for me, there's a lot of framework of like grief around all of this, and then and like meeting them wherever they're at and trying to really figure out where that is and then how that impacts me. Yeah, so kind of speaking to that nuance, like there's, even within a culture, there's a lot of nuance, and then that personal nuance of like even where they're at. Like I had a client who's is South Korean but was adopted, and in a very isolated fundamentalist community, and so wasn't even connected to a community, and his adopted family was white. And I was asking him questions. He's never even thought about how adoption has impacted him. He hasn't even thought about how being raised by white parents has impacted him. I said, are you ever, he's also like a history buff. So I'm like, have you ever like really felt a draw to like learn about, you know, South Korean history? And he was like, no, like I've almost even kind of avoided it. So again, like that curiosity piece for me is always like a huge framework in kind of feeling out and trying to meet the client right where they're at. So
beautiful, John. Thank you for sharing that. I think another part of it too that kind of comes out to just like round out the slide is, like Marcus said, we're not going to be experts in everything. So if we put a foot wrong, I think we also want to hold some tenderness with ourselves and kind of knowing like, hey, this is a learning experience. I learned something today, or I want to learn something more about this particular, you know, person or this particular story of this person that's sitting across from me. And I think as clinicians, there's often times like this, like, I don't want to do any harm to my clients ever. That we also just have to, you know, recognize like you're not doing harm. It's just you're not going to be an expert in everything. But that's why we're creating the space to talk about these things openly and honestly, and you know, give him that loving attention. So that way we can, you know, have that vulnerability with our clients of like, I didn't recognize this was something, tell me more about it. And then that will invite that vulnerability back. And that can be such a beautiful, such a restorative dynamic.
Yeah, I like that, because whether within this framework or any other one, what we often don't get is like repair or recognition of harm being made, right? So I even see like that's within my clinical framework. I am probably going to harm you out of my own unconscious incompetence or conscious competence. And there's a sense of like, but we actually get to engage in repair. And that is the thing that often doesn't happen. And that helps me like keep my shame and guilt at bay so that I can like keep my full mind, again, like where grief is just so helpful there. Like, yes, we'll have to grieve that we will participate in what we have been a part of all our lives and all we know. So the hope for me there is not to not make a mistake, but to that I get to engage in repair with you, because we both, like you said, just can say out loud what actually happened, and you rarely get that.
Yeah, beautifully said, John. I think another thing too that can be another tool that's really helpful, and like I referenced earlier, I kind of got this idea from It Didn't Start With You, of engaging culture of origin kind of like a story, right? Like you come into therapy and tell me what's been going on this week, or the things that you want to work on and kind of the patterns that have kind of come out of that. But I think another piece of it too is there's going to be bits and parts and things missing out of that story if, culture of origin or identity aren't necessarily things that we talk about. So I think it's something that can also, I love to talk to my clients about that, where I want to understand you, the whole person, not just you noticing these anxiety symptoms kind of coming up and working on just that, because it's going to help me understand more of where you're coming from, more of some other items and things that are coming up, more of just who you are. And I think once I started to kind of just like break it down in that way and guide the conversation in that direction, a lot of clients kind of started to be like, that's an interesting way to kind of just like talk about these things. Because it's not just my anxiety happens because I have to give a presentation or, go to the doctor or, talk to my partner about something really heavy and tough. It has its origins. It has a story that's connected with it. And it's really important to kind of look at it that way. I think that's also another way too, that guiding these conversations, it can seem a lot less heavy. And we can just, again, address it with the love, the tenderness, the warm embrace that it deserves. So that's how I kind of like to guide those conversations with my clients and kind of just starting out to see whether they, connect with that, or if they don't, kind of just like sharing where my perspective kind of comes from around that. I also love giving a little metaphor of multiple hats. So just like on the image that I have on my presentation, we all have different hats that we wear. So if we go to the mountains and hike around, we're going to wear a wool cap, right, to keep ourselves warm. If we're at the beach, we're going to have a sun hat. If we're hiking, we might have just like, like a baseball cap, whatever, right? I like to give this like silly like analogy sometimes, because depending on where we are, we will wear a different hat. And I think that's also kind of true to the cultural identities that we identify with. When I'm with other Hispanics or Latinos, I start speaking in Spanish. And that's something that, depending on, like how well I know this person and how connected they are to that part of their identity, if they're able to speak Spanish, they may or may not take me up on. But, it's just something that I kind of have, through my own sort of experiences, I've kind of just like felt much more okay kind of doing that and trying to engage that way. And same thing with, other parts of my identity, like being American, like I also in other places kind of have that hat on and, kind of switch into that hat when I'm interacting with other people that might be from, like other places. Like I didn't share this part of my identity with you guys, but I'm originally from the East Coast. So when I meet with other East Coasters, I'm like, hey, we're on the West Coast now. And, there's kind of like this connectedness there too. That's kind of silly, but, it kind of merits its own sort of like piece. But again, like there's multiple hats that I have, that sometimes I wear one, sometimes I wear another, but they're still a part of me and they're a part of that identity.
Oh yeah, especially like how identities show up in different workplace situations or social situations. That it's so much more fluid than just this is the identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to share that my husband is from Midwest, and his background is a German. All the families are married German to each other. But when I say when we went to Armenia and I presented him, and they said, "So who he is?" I said, "American," and said, "But who is he?" When I say German, he said, "But I don't feel like I am German," because it's like 7 generation or so. And so he observed something in me that I never thought about. He said, when you're talking with your Karabakh people, and when we go to visit them, you are so loud, your eyes are shining. I never see you that way. And only when you talk with them, you are that way. And when I talk with Russian, because I lived 10 years in Moscow also, and partially I also feel that culture. I am different, more settled, more calm, and talking. Karabakh, we kind of we don't take turns in conversation. The voice is going up and down, and everyone talks at the same time. And I'm not sure who hears. Unconsciousness hears, but yeah. So my husband started telling me things that I haven't been thinking, aware. Yeah, that's interesting for me.
The difference between audio levels is definitely something. So like from my husband's Russian like family, they're very like quiet and value like their low voice. And my husband one time saw me, one of my aunts, my mom, and my cousin all talking together. And he's like, I thought you guys were angry at each other. And I'm like, oh no, we're just having a conversation about like just anything. But the tonal difference can be so significant because, yeah, like when we're with a certain culture, we can adjust that tone. And I notice too, like when I'm speaking in English, my tone of voice is much more calm, much more sort of settled. When I'm speaking in Spanish, I'm speaking fast, I'm speaking loud, I'm speaking, with like a lot of hand gestures, which I do anyways. But it's those parts that, are beautiful and kind of just like bring out those differences. And it's just funny to see. So, yeah. All right. So we are 10:01. I think we should probably take our 5-minute break. So I will see y'all at 10:06.
Great. Awesome.
Well, she's so loud. Oh. Well, 10:06. So I wanted to kind of just take a moment as you guys are getting settled back, getting your drink of water, drink of coffee, or whatever. I wanted to continue the conversation around what we continue this work to be like and continue to kind of keep in mind. We've talked about some tools and some ways to kind of guide this very important conversation and exploration with our clients. But just like as clinicians, we're required by the state and also just ethically bound to continue our education in a lot of different areas. I think multicultural topics and exploration requires a lot of that work too. So I wanted to ask you guys, aside from just like having conversations with clients, embracing our own differences and where we come from, where our clients come from, doing more research and, kind of continuing to just like be curious and learn more. What are some ways that you guys might be thinking of continuing to expand your knowledge around multicultural issues as it comes to the clients and populations that you work with?
I think for me, the first thing that comes up is just to keep exploring my own, implicit biases, and to be willing to engage those as they come up. Blind spots, missed connections with people, assumptions that I'm making, that I'm not even aware that I'm making. So that feels the most kind of like tender spot for me in continuing to grow in that way. Yeah.
Thank you, Marcus. Go on.
You're bringing up for me too, along with what Marcus just said, I've been thinking about the real importance of humility on the part of a clinician, and just the kind of curiosity I think that we're talking about today is not the quality of it is not intrusive. It's not sort of like looking to clients to teach us, like, you tell me, just that slight, the nuance of the intention of our, with it held within our curiosity. And then consultation is so wonderful. Like, if there are opportunities to consult with clinicians who do have a connection to that culture that you might be wanting to learn more about, or just have a connection to resources, or just can offer other perspectives, I think is really key.
Thank you, Emily.
I think the things that come to mind for me is like the more I know and the more I learn, the more, hopefully I can own that I don't really know anything, or I don't really know much. Like it just is giving me some cushion, or some tools to maybe engage, but that, like, my ego never sort of thinks that it's accomplished something in terms of learning of a culture of a client, and that every client is like a culture onto themselves. Like they are bringing, each emergence of a client is a new person on each day that I see them in each moment. So I think those are some things that I, for my own ego and for my own sense of like groundedness, trying to hold more.
Okay. Thank you, Shaquille.
Kind of two things. When because a lot of times, like, sometimes clients will be put onto my schedule that I haven't talked with yet or anything, and if their name, I don't actually know how to pronounce it, I try to like look up, and like there's even some like websites you can go to and they'll like pronounce it for you. I never know 100% if it's correct, but I try to do that extra effort of, again, that there's always this tension between, I need to be teachable but also not put you in, have the burden of teaching me. And I think that tension is just always there. Like, you just can't get rid of it. So there's anything that I can do proactively to take that burden off of them. And again, like, yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to do that, but there's like the tension of like, that burden is there, I can't get rid of it, but is there anything I can do to help carry it with you or share that with you? I think that's the best I can do. So I think there's a lot of avenues in which I'm looking for that, whether it's through researching a culture, but again, like, I can't get rid of that, but I can at least help share the burden with you. So
the name piece is one of those ones that's particularly sensitive to me in a lot of respects. And I'm happy you brought it up, John, because if you have a non-traditional name, oftentimes, and I want to hear maybe from others who might have maybe had a different experience, but oftentimes people hesitate to even try to pronounce your name instead of just asking, hey, how do you say your name? Or how do you pronounce this? Or sometimes people just go into and being like, Dania Uritskiy, right? Like, it's something that I think sometimes can be really touching and very powerful to just ask, like, hey, how do you say this? Or, maybe doing some like background research if you can on how to kind of embrace that. Because even if somebody doesn't have, a very traditional name, we want to still honor and, respect that. I've also encountered a lot of clients that have had to Americanize their names for the sake of, lots of institutions or lots of places might not be able to, kind of pronounce their name. And that's been a really interesting topic of conversation, education, exploration with a lot of clients that I've done in my own sort of work with clients, where we kind of want to see, like, okay, you don't have a traditional name. but does that mean that that's something that we should, sever and connect or disconnect from? Like, I'll share a very personal example. My husband's name, for example, is not a traditional, even Russian name. His name is German. When he immigrated to Canada, they forced him to change his name to Gary because it was easier to say. And for the longest time, he would go by Gary. And recently he started to embrace like, no, my name is German and I'm going to be called German. But even in those moments where people might have had these like changes to their name, it's really curious to kind of just like explore that and, continue that conversation, because even in something that we might take for granted as our names, there's still a lot of systems of oppression. Like, oh, your name is too complicated. What, can't I just call you this instead to make my life easier? As opposed to just kind of like saying, well, do you want to be called that? Is that something that you're okay with? Or can we possibly open up the topic of conversation of what you want to be called? And, how do we kind of go about navigating that barrier system of oppression that we might encounter on a very regular basis? Yep, Kenneth, go for it.
Hey, so I totally echo all that you just said. I think a question that I really like to ask clients along those lines is, how does your family say your name, or how do your close friends, like what do your close friends call you? It feels like a nice, easy way to get them to open up in that way.
Perfect. Yeah. Love that.
So I just, right before the training, I asked Dania how to pronounce your last name, because we worked together for years, but we don't call each other's last names. and I mean, hopefully it seemed okay. Yeah. But also, I think just trying to be respectful about whatever the approach is. I also have clients who I will ask, like Kenneth just said, like, how do you like to be called? Mm-hmm. And I've had clients tell me like basically a nickname that's nothing to do with their legal name and is completely what they like to be called. And they wouldn't necessarily have told me that just early on directly if I was using their legal name that's on paper. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say another thing too, just continuing this work and education piece. Don't be ashamed of doing research either on your own. I always find myself kind of, like if I don't know something or I'm really curious about somebody's experience based on something that we've talked about, I always like to just Google and, kind of research and read stuff online and kind of just like, continue to expand my breadth of knowledge. I'm a big history person too, so like that I know definitely kind of just drives a little bit more naturally for me. But when we don't know something, I think instead of kind of being ashamed, like, oh, I don't know, or this isn't something of my culture, am I going to overstep my bounds? That's definitely a blind spot. And we want to kind of be very aware and continue to kind of grow in that area, right? Because again, vulnerability opens up vulnerability. And when we're more vulnerable with like, hey, I don't really know much about, Judaism. And, that's not something that's really like a breath of my sort of like identification and culture, but we want to learn more about it. That's definitely something where we can kind of continue to expand and grow and, just have more of a knowledge base there. I think another thing too, that's really beautiful, and I want to hear others' thoughts about this too, is we also start to see like we have cultural differences, yes, and we have regional differences, yes, and language differences, yes. But at the end of the day, I think I've also gotten a bigger appreciation of just like the humanness of everybody's experience. And it's made me feel like a lot more connected when I start to kind of read about, other cultures and other histories and other things, that I think it just kind of opens up more and more of the humanness and curiosity of the work.
I also sometimes ask my client because I work in psychoanalytic approach, I after kind of this discussion, I realized that a lot of that I am doing anyway. I don't find specific question to know their culture, because when they talk about here and now, I connect that with then, and then they always bring the culture. It comes anyway. It is harder with many generational Americans because I see that there is a gap. They feel gap. There's nothing. It's only a small kind of siblings, mother, father, if they were not in a church or so I feel like there is a lot of gap, and it's difficult for me culturally to connect. I noticed that in my work has been easier flowing with first generation immigrants or immigrants, but I always meet this vacuum, this bubble that they are meeting when we are trying to explore their own culture, family, ancestral, and the connection, the one I know, I can't find in them, and I see that they're grieving and they're missing it. So with immigrants, I ask sometimes question, how this sound in your language? When they want to say, my mom said this in English, I said, so can I? And they say it, and I pronounce it again, and I feel like I connect. And they say, yeah, that sounds right. And it is very familiar. So that helps to connect with their culture.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
It's interesting, Margarita. It makes me wonder if that's a part of American culture, right? The being less the culture being less of a obvious, rich, upfront piece, and it being more of gapped and separated and having to be drawn out. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think maybe my thoughts are because America is the political, it's American as a government. That's the identification. I am from East Side. I am from Midwest. I am from there, but there is no a long history of ancestral. Not only your own history, they don't. It feels like the connection. I don't know. In my culture, it's very important for your child to speak that, to identify with it. Identity is a big part of your parenting, the cultural identity. Here it's very individual culture, like everyone is an individual. So then they also feel lonely and isolated. And when I noticed that it's harder for them to find the friendship, is more this kind of theme is coming. I feel lonely in my social, because there is a few things that I can connect, or I don't read very quick. The social language, I don't want to.
Yeah, well, and I think to what something Dania said earlier, then it can be easy to attribute everything individually to an individual failing or struggle without reaching into the bigger context. Yeah.
I think another thing too is being able to join groups where not only like case consults is a perfect one, but I think also just groups that can help us kind of connect with other parts of culture or places that kind of draw these things out can be very useful and very helpful, both in our professional and also in our personal lives too. Just because I think they're just really beautiful opportunities to connect and, kind of see different parts of identity that might be the same or might be different from ours, right? And I also encourage clients to do the same thing, because I think sometimes we might kind of feel as if, well, kind of to something that Margarita was saying, like we might feel isolated or we might feel stuck. And I think sometimes we as humans, we're very social creatures and we draw a lot of energy from others. So when we're able to come in community with each other and kind of like partake in cultural celebrations or, other parts that kind of celebrate other parts of our identity, it can be really beneficial to help alleviate some of that stuckness, some of that isolation that we might experience. So I think that's another valuable way that we can, explore culture and identity and, kind of be immersed in it and, kind of come together and just have a good time together. Like we just had Dia de los Muertos, right? As sort of like thing. And it's beautiful to see like, a lot of the Mexican traditions that people in Seattle have kind of like started to cultivate. And even if I recognize they're different from El Salvador, but we still celebrate Dia de los Muertos. So it's beautiful to kind of just have that connection through, the lens of the Mexican American community here. And, I also got to learn stuff because I'm like, oh, in El Salvador, we do Dia de los Muertos like this, but in Mexico, this is what they do, or this is, other aspects of their sort of cultural differences that kind of come up. I think another thing too that we continue to do when we encourage clients or encourage ourselves to kind of build community, it starts to also heal maybe some of those generational wounds or trauma that we experience. Just because again, that connectedness can be super important towards like healing and repairing some of these larger colonial and, systemic systems that might be a part of our culture. We also start to educate and, kind of change the shape of some of these things that have kind of been passed down generationally. And I'll touch on for really briefly around the colorism that happens in the Hispanic Latinx community, where I've noticed with older generations like my parents who might have immigrated or might have already been here, it's not as big of a topic of conversation or recognition. But people that are my age or younger, it's starting to become more and more of a conversation piece, especially as my generation starts to have their own kids, where they start to kind of talk about these things a little bit more openly and a little bit more curiously with their children or with other family members, where, somebody with curly hair doesn't have pelo malo, which is something that we usually say when somebody has curly hair, which literally translates to bad hair. But they just have pelo colocho, right? Like curly hair, and that's it. And we don't have to continue sort of using those words. Or I know there's certain terminology that we might use to describe somebody being, like uneducated or uncultured that we would say, oh, they're being an indio, right? Which literally translates to them being an indigenous person, which for the longest time, I know my parents, people of their generation have definitely like normalized. But me and others that I've talked to, we're like, screw that. We're not going to continue that and using that as part of our language. And it's really nice to kind of come together and talk about these things because for the longest time, a lot of us have felt those, senses of racism and discrimination and preference over skin color and hair, texture and all of that stuff. That now we're starting to break that down. And hopefully with future generations, that's something that we start to heal that trauma. Anybody have any sort of like parts of their experience or parts of their cultural identity that they've started to kind of engage in with others and kind of like helping heal some of the trauma that might be associated with that? through conversation, through groups that they're a part of?
Could you, Dania, ask that question again?
Sure.
I'm trying to, understand it.
So kind of like with my example of the systemic racism that's kind of like perpetuated within Hispanic Latinx culture, and how, connecting with others of my generation, talking with other family members of the same sort of like generation and younger, we've started to kind of like dismantle or started to tackle that issue in our community. Have any of you guys been part of groups or other, sort of like places where, again, we start to dismantle or heal some of those generational wounds? Hopefully that was a little bit more clear.
Yeah, I think my clients are healing me with, especially coming back to American clients. With them, I learned so much about how I am racist and how my culture was raised. Because for how male and female discrimination, the gender discrimination is so huge in my culture, and then kind of with their experience with their experience, I learned a lot about it, and I started asking myself question, how do I look at it? And then when I now listen songs or in Russian or Armenian, even in a long time, I felt like in Russia, there's no, not that much of a gender discrimination compared to Armenian. And now I hear it even more so. So I start noticing that, and it really, it helps me to feel what is the equality here, and I feel much better here, in that way, and in this relationship then.
Thank you, Margarita.
Dania, I don't have that in my life, and hearing you talk about it, I'm thinking how badly I have been wanting that or needing that, particularly as a secular Jew right now. Just how difficult it can be to find community to find community. Maybe for me, I'm not in somewhere where I grew up. I'm not from here. So yeah, I just don't have necessarily an example to give, but I'm just really feeling the magnitude of this discussion for me. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lily. Kenneth, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I've got a handful of clients who are like tall, Black, African American dudes. And one of the things I try to name to them a lot or discuss with them is like the ways in which they have really had to make themselves smaller as like a part of their own survival, and like the cost of making themselves small, the cost of not taking up space. In particular, I've got a client he's Afro-Latinx, he's Black, and his mom's from Costa Rica, grew up going to Spanish speaking church, and I'm also Costa Rican, and so one of the things I talked to him about is like his difficulty in like figuring out how he identifies with the Latino culture. So I'm always just trying to like name the racism and colorism within Latinidad, and encouraging him to explore like what does it look like for you to take on this sort of identity, making sure that he's feeling validated that he can like explore with this sort of identity. But it's all really hard and messy and gross. And, there's a lot of pain there for him.
Yeah. Kenneth, can I ask you something there? If you're comfortable sharing or expanding on that, when you start to mention sort of like the messiness and, sort of like some of those like ickier feelings, how have you sort of dealt or processed with that? Being the therapist and holding the space there.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, I tried to name the ickiness of it as a way to give my clients space to give them some space to like feel whatever they're feeling about it. I don't know. I feel like definitely have been on like my own journey, and like have done like a lot of my own self-reflection of, reflecting on like how my family has been like really racist, or my family has been really classist in a lot of ways. And so I think at the moment, I'm not necessarily at a space where that necessarily bothers me, just because I have some acceptance around it and like have an idea as to like how I want to like to push back against that. But yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I want to echo something there through Kenneth's experience. I think part of also how we talk about this and bring it up is we also have to do our own work and healing around that. And I know I've done a lot of like my own therapy work, focusing specifically on like the racism and, colorism that exists within my community, because it is a very big part of my story. But then I also, like you guys have also been talking about, I definitely bring that to the work that I do. And it's kind of like a continued mutual healing with my clients that are, very much like still hurt, or there's still a lot of like wounds that come up there. It's something that we embrace. But I also know that I know myself well enough as a clinician too, that this is a space where I've done my own work and healed. And I can kind of bring and merge that experience with the experience that they're bringing into the room and kind of continue to grow. And some of the conversations that I've had, I've just like been so blown away, kind of reflecting on them afterwards, because it's just like added to, again, that beautiful humanity and richness and, complicatedness and, sometimes icky and sticky parts of our cultural identity. But it's also something too that's made me a lot braver to just kind of bring and name those things outright, as opposed to kind of like skirting around them or, kind of like not feeling comfortable. And I've seen this particularly also kind of translating to some clients that I work with that are Filipino or Filipino American, and how, there's a lot of kind of like cross-cultural sort of places where that does pop up, and kind of doing this work within my own community and within myself has kind of helped us have discussions very openly about that with, their community, or with my Indian clients or Indian American clients, a very similar sort of thing. So I think when something can be very icky or sticky, it might be worthwhile kind of looking at a little bit more and saying, why does that kind of bring those feelings and those reactions to us, and kind of continue to do our own work in healing to, again, break down those systemic barriers and, continue to fight the oppression that has existed throughout our history, wherever we come from.
Yeah, another thing that you said, Kenneth, about class, I think, including that in this as well, is like another thing we don't really talk about much in America.
Yeah.
Acknowledge the deep class system that we're all participating in and trying to navigate. And so I just think it also made me think of gender as well. And I know that's why this cultural topic is so massive so quickly. But yeah, anyway, just started things churning.
I just want to add a plug for something I just listened to. I love that you brought up class, and there's a great podcast called Classy, and it's like 8 episodes, and he's an NPR reporter, I believe, but each episode he looks at like a different way that it shows up, and it's very good, and it's really fun, and learned a lot.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing, Sheila. There's so many different ways that we can get information. My group practice is super into reading books, so I know that that's something that a lot of clinicians kind of lean into, getting information, podcasts, having conversations, being a part of groups. Whatever your flavor is, I want y'all to think about that and kind of continue to see, how do I incorporate this as part of my practice? I know we're kind of like nearing the end of our time today, but I wanted for us to have a discussion around over-identification. I'm going to frame it this way. I think over-identification happens to all of us and all of our different identities. It's a very normal part of the therapeutic sort of dynamics that happen in the room. And I know a lot of therapists, when we start to kind of talk about that, they like a lot of feelings of shame or stickiness or other things kind of come up. But I want us to kind of, again, look at that as part of our blind spots that we're working on, and we all have them, but it's okay, right? Instead of feeling afraid of like, oh my gosh, I'm over identifying with this person, I'm going to do harm. We want to kind of take that into a space of curiosity and kind of see what happens there. Just some, like bigger things to kind of just be aware of. Again, just because we share maybe a lot of cultural identity markers or cultural sort of like factor components, it doesn't mean that, our experience is going to be the same exact experience as the person that's sitting across from us, right? So just like we've talked about in the spirit of today, we want to have curiosity and conversation with people and, with their experiences to kind of just get those clarifying points. So don't be afraid to ask. Just, kind of like continue that curiosity. And if you do, that's also okay. I think John said earlier, right? Like he's part of his framework is, I'm going to do harm just, out of my ignorance or out of, my perceived competence. But at the end of the day, we'll have an opportunity to repair. And that's definitely part of the philosophy that I carry in my practice, but I also want y'all to carry in, kind of wrapping up today's conversation and, kind of thinking about this a little bit more. I know I found myself sometimes kind of being connected to somebody's story, and sometimes that kind of leads me to kind of jump to conclusions like, oh, this must be how this person must have perceived this. But through many years of kind of practicing with different people and different populations, I've had to kind of develop a cue for myself around how to kind of acknowledge that dynamic and what do I kind of work with that. Because just like I've said within my own community, it's not a monolith. There's so many different time periods that people immigrate from and backgrounds and even countries that they come from, that my experience with somebody who identifies as Mexican American or somebody who identifies as Colombian American is going to be very, very different. And, we talk about that. We embrace that. I want to hear from you guys if there's any experiences or any times that you've noticed over identification with a client's story and how you guys have kind of navigated through that, or ideas of how to navigate through that now.
I think for me, I've seen that happen when something kind of, it's a similar thread of anger for me and my client, where like we both start kind of rising in terms of our like frustration or be the kind of upset that we're feeling. And I have to kind of like check in and remind myself that this isn't just a conversation. I think when I start to feel my own story and an exchange that feels really human and genuine, that's good for the therapeutic work, but it starts to kind of like blur the lines for me of what we're there to do. Yeah. I think I sometimes will just like to like say that out loud, like this isn't my therapy session, and it kind of it helps like cut through and in the moment that's happening, but also not kind of like run away from it. Like we're here to do something else, but I really really feel you and hear you. It's like really clearly evident, and I want to see if we can stay with you and not just jump into like the meta area of talking about how hard things are. Yeah, and I found that in moments like that, clients, in my experience, typically feel like that makes sense to them and they actually want to return back to something. Or they might ask me more questions, but we're clear on what we're doing.
Perfect. Thank you, Shaquille. Jackie?
Sometimes I can over-identify when it comes to like religious trauma in particular, and just kind of trying to always be aware of my own countertransference, but sometimes you can assume that your story of harm is the same story of harm with somebody else, and I have definitely erred on that at times, or to assume that somebody, just because they've been part of a religious system that they have harm when maybe they don't. And so I think that can be an area of cultural experience that's really cool to be aware of.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. I think it also just comes in like the basic principle too of love and care for our clients. Like, you know, there's obviously parts of how we kind of form connection and, you know, sort of interaction with clients. And obviously there's going to be maybe like factors that might be similar, but just like Jackie said, I think it's also a very strong and powerful place to, you know, continue to explore that and continue to remind ourselves like, hey, my experience around religious, you know, trauma and things like that is not going to be the same as this other person. So let me continue to just ask them and kind of lean into that space of curiosity.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Shaquille said about naming it when it hits the zeitgeist level. I mean, it's easy to be having my own experience as well around the world, and then not really just echoing what you said, Shaquille, like not wanting to ignore it, wanting to include it, but weave it back into the therapy. That's a really helpful point of orientation for me.
I think our own personal therapy, if we bring to our therapy and work through that, and supervisions are, I usually take, if I see that it's continuing and I'm not able to, if I see that I'm bringing too much of my own, and first, if my experience comes there, I'm asking myself question, did it come because client wanted me to bring and experience their feelings that they didn't want to feel their anger, and usually we connect with just not nowhere feeling, you know, it's not coming from nowhere. We connect it with our own experience, but it's actually because client wanted us to feel. So I ask those questions to myself, and if I feel that no, it's something is wrong with it, but I can't figure it out, I'm taking the case to supervision and trying to figure it out there.
And Margarita, you bring up a good point. This is also another piece and component that I want to pass on to y'all, like around seeking supervision or seeking case consult that can kind of help around sometimes these cultural pieces. You want to make sure that you're working with somebody who, you know, kind of has a lot of knowledge and a lot of breadth around this. Again, not an expert, but is also kind of comfortable hosting these conversations, because through our supervision, especially as we get more advanced in licensure, it can be super helpful to kind of help us just identify some of these stuck points that inevitably we're all going to come through. And, you know, just kind of have a more holistic, well-rounded perspective as we're working with clients that are very different from us and, you know, have their own experiences. All right. Well, I want to kind of just round out this conversation and encourage y'all to continue this work. We had a lot of lovely perspectives, conversation, and I appreciate you guys for sharing your experiences throughout this training. But again, it doesn't just stop here. And I hope today's conversation, kind of like how Lily brought up, you know, this is something that I really want to kind of continue in my own life, and I want to see what this looks like. I want to encourage for all of you guys, just because it's not a one and done, right? It's a work in progress as always, and therapy allows for that space. So if you dedicate some of your CEUs or some of your supervision time towards kind of exploring some of these places, we're already making such a big difference with the work that we're doing and kind of bringing the importance towards the multicultural perspective into our own work. Because from what I've gathered from all of you, like it's not only just a topic of interest, but you've also encountered it in your own work. So whether it's through professional groups, personal groups, other places, please, please, please continue this work. As promised too, I just saw Marcus dropped the CEU certificate link. So if you could complete that evaluation when you get a chance and just provide us some feedback on today's presentation, that would be much appreciated. And I'm going to leave the room open for any questions for the next 10 minutes that you guys might have, or any other topics that you guys want to explore.
Just a quick thing. I think it's saying that.
Oh, go ahead.
It's saying I need permission to access the.
Yeah, let me see if I can just change it right away.
Same for me, yeah.
Yeah. Why is it?
I think it defaults that only people in the organization.
Right. That's gotta be that. I didn't. Here's what I would like you to do. If I'll put the. Will you email me if you're outside of self space, because I didn't set up the form, and that way I can make sure it gets accessible. So just email me with your email, and then let me put the name of the training here as well. Thank you guys for clicking right on that. I'm glad. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Well, any other questions that pop up, I'll hang around for the next 10 minutes, as also Marcus is kind of trying to sort out this technical detail. Otherwise, have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you guys for kicking your weekend off with our training today. And hopefully you guys have gotten some good information, some good perspectives, some good conversation in today's discussion.
Thanks, Dania.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dania.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dania. Really wonderful to be a part of this deal. Hopefully everyone can see my email at this point, so we can make sure you get your CEUs. Just send me an email and we'll get it sorted out. Okay. I'm going to turn off the recording, but we'll leave the video up for another couple minutes.
Yeah.